When we analyze a work of art in this course, and critics do this as well, it's really important to begin with the material data before you leap into things like what it means and its symbolism and other aspects. We are often very theoretical when we first meet works of art. We want to explain our feelings about it or the feeling of the artist, but we often don't really see what's right in front of us. And the materiality is very important, just as a base, just to make sure that we really understand the work itself. And this is especially important in an online course because we're not in front of the works themselves in a gallery. And I wish I could take you to some of these galleries myself, and we stand in front of the works, as I've done with other students, other places I've taught, and we just take our time and we go through this work. But since we can't be in front of the work, we can't really have that bodily interaction with it. So we need to really use our imaginations and our digital tools online to get into the work itself. So when we begin any analysis in this course, it begins very simply. Tell us the main data, the main pieces of data about the work itself. And that begins with, what is the title of the work? Find out what the title is. You may have to find it out in its own language. Was it named by the artist, or was this named afterwards? You might need to indicate that. Then you find out who the artist is. If there is no artist, you just say no artist. But you need to find out what the artist's name is and spell the name right, of course. Title, artist, date. When was it made? Look this up and you find out when it was initiated, when it was completed. Some works of art take many years, sometimes dozens of years to complete. So you might have a beginning and an ending date to that particular work of art. Certainly if it's a work of architecture, it might take generations to make. And so you would put a beginning date and an end date when it was finally consecrated or opened up. So that might be basic data right there, but it gets much more interesting when we get into other types of data. First off, the size. What size is this? Well, look it up and find out the size of that work of art. If it's a small size, we might have a relationship with it that's very different than if it's something that's larger than us. A work of architecture we walk through, so we have this kind of experience of it being like a mother and we're walking into its womb. Whereas sculpture, we typically walk around, especially in graveyards when you see lots of gravestones and other sculptures. You're walking around the sculpture and you relate to it like you would a friend or a lover. Not like a child is to a mother as you do in architecture. Painting is a little different because painting is a bit of a deception, right? You're looking at this representation of a world and you feel like you're looking out a window, especially if it's in a frame, and this kind of other magical world is opening up in front of you that has depth, when in fact we know it doesn't have any depth. It's very thin. So we need to know about its size, and we also need to know about its materiality, its media. And this you will have to typically look up. It often will say things like oil on canvas, but it isn't so simple. Oil on canvas was really something that evolved, and at different times, different pigments were available, different types of supports. So it may not be canvas, it might be wood, it might be some other support that might hold the paint itself. And you need to look it up, and also look at the processes of how they ground the pigments and binded them together with, say, the oil itself, or is it egg tempera in which you're binding together with egg to make a lighter type of paint that can bring out really fine details. So, there's mosaic, there's the ochres and the ash that was used by ancient peoples for some of the most ancient art that we have. That was readily available by grinding up stone and then just grinding it up and then applying it directly to other stone or a stick or wood. So get a sense of the materiality and how difficult the process is. When it comes to architecture, get a sense of how complex it is to, for instance, build a pyramid or build Stonehenge, carrying those stones over many, many miles to set them upright on a particular landscape. And then you have to get a sense of how many people would that entail over how long a period. Keep in mind that artists often have assistants, so they might have a huge workshop grinding paints for them and putting together the supports, and as well as other assistants that might help them with their little business that they have. So this is all getting a sense of the material data, the size, the who did it, when, where, and in what context. Where was it originally presented? That's another aspect. So you might say it was originally painted in Rome, and eventually it became part of the British Museum in 1912. So that's important data because we now know where it's traveled and why it's hanging on a gallery in London, and we need to somehow know why they think it's important. Maybe it wasn't because of that journey, who knows? Place. Its journey, who owns it? That's another aspect. Who owns this thing? Who bought it? Who is the patron for the artist to create this? Sometimes they have a certain patronage. Who sat for it? If there is a figure in the painting, who is that person who's sitting in the painting, and what is their status? Be it a woman or man or prince or king. And did they pay for it, or did some ambassador pay for it to get their good favor? These are all, I would call, the material data of a work of art. Let's go through an example and a counterexample, just to make this interesting. An example that comes to mind is the example when many people think of art, they think of one particular painting, and that's the Mona Lisa. It's considered to be the most expensive, most valuable painting in the world. Recently estimated about $750 million as its worth. People in the French government want to sell it in order to feed the poor. There's a lot of controversy around this work, and there always was. So in a work such as this, you would report on its materiality very carefully, of course. You begin with its name. La Gioconda is what they call it in Italian. In English, we call it Mona Lisa. It's made by who? Leonardo da Vinci, of course. And Leonardo is a Renaissance painter, and we know that he painted it between 1503 to 1513. It's disputed, and you might put that down. You might put down two dates, and the two dates are in a discussion between various art historians right now, and you make a quick note of that. Then we move to the size. What size is this thing? Now, try to guess right now in your mind, how big is this? And typically people think that, well, her head is probably the size of my head and it's real to life. No, this thing's actually quite small. This is 21 inches by 30 inches. Okay, so she's much smaller. This isn't life size at all. We see most of her body in the image. You might get out your ruler or your tape measure and actually tape measure this and get a sense of the size of the work of art, especially in relationship to your own body. In this case, it's smaller than me, so I could walk with it, carry it. And that's really important to know that this is something one person could carry. Why? Because of the date, when it was made. 16th century, this is the transition between medieval era and the early modern era. And in the medieval era, art was really part of, especially in Florence when this was made, part of the religious Catholic world. And you would often take paintings off the wall and you would march them through the city because they are paintings of the saints. you would kiss them and you would carry them up in procession to a church, up to the altar and put it on the altar. These things were worked with, and they still do this with many statues and paintings today in Italy. It's well known that you're interacting bodily with this work of art. There are songs that were special songs sung in front of various works of art. Incense, of course, prayers done, you meditate with works of art. We're moving out of that period into kind of an early modernism, and in which now we're getting kind of secular art. And so what we're looking at is a work of art that could be carried, but it isn't. And a typical image that would be carried at the time would be an image of the Virgin Mary, very important to Catholicism, which was the religion practiced in Florence at that time. So this Mona Lisa woman is kind of like the Virgin Mary, although she's not really wearing the blue of the Virgin Mary, and she's not the typical Virgin Mary itself. That would be moving into the interpretation, but it's important to know that size opens up these possibilities. What else would we look at here? We would look at the place. It was painted in Florence, as I've already mentioned. It has surrounded by a ritual practice, and that's really important. But, that's Florence, it's the early Renaissance, and, it's just like here. Well, no. Florence is not like anywhere at that time. And here's where you go into your internet and you look it up and you find a population of Florence in 1513, when the Mona Lisa was made, and you'll find that the population of Florence was around 60,000 people. Oh, what is that equivalent to? That's the equivalent to West Haven, Connecticut. West Haven, Connecticut. Let's see. West Haven, Connecticut. I think it has a Civil War monument in it. It is famous for being the town where Smokey Joe Wood, the pitcher of the Boston Red Sox from 1908 to 1915, was born. And it's well known, of course, that he played on a women's team for a number of years and before he was recognized and brought into the major leagues. So Smokey Joe, who had a blazing fastball, is the highlight of the historical West Haven, Connecticut history. Florence, of the same size, had a few other historical people within it. And I won't go into the political people, the Medicis, of course, and the cardinals and popes and others who lived there. 60,000 people. Who else lived there during this time? Just the artists themselves. Brunelleschi, Ghiberti, Donatello, Fra Angelico, Uccello, Lippi, Piero della Francesca, Verrocchio, Botticelli, Botticelli of the Venus, and Michelangelo of the David. He built his David right there. Raphael, Andrea del Sarto, they're all working in that time and place. And it's the concentration of artistic talent just at that point in time was intense. Only mimicked, one might say, by Paris in the 1920s, when Picasso and his buddies, Cézanne and Matisse and others were working heavily at painting in an intense manner. So Florence is a very particular time, a very particular space and time in the history of art. And we need to know that Mona Lisa was actually something that came out of that time, and in fact was a really important work of art for Leonardo. Okay? It wasn't considered a really big and important work of art, although the insiders knew it was very good, but Leonardo thought it was amazing. Why? Why do we know this? Because he kept it for himself. He kept it in his studio, so that when patrons came by, they would look at it and he would show it and say, this is what I can do. It was like his website or his storefront. And so we know it was important to him. Otherwise, it really wasn't an important work of art until around 1860. Then a couple of French historians said, this is a pretty important work of art. And they tried to make that argument. It was only a few of them. And that grew. It grew a bit, and then some British art historians saying, yeah, this is, in the corpus of Leonardo da Vinci, this was an important work of art. It's an important work of art. And so this is me here. Here I am telling you about the history and provenance of the work. Here we now have some historians. It's in the Louvre in Paris. That's where it was owned. And the historians are saying, this is kind of interesting, this is kind of interesting. Then one thing happened which put it into another stratosphere compared to all other works of art. In 1911, it was stolen. It was stolen, and the first two people that were questioned when it was stolen were Apollinaire, the poet, who is the best friends with Pablo Picasso, 1911. And the two of them were brought in and questioned about the theft of the Mona Lisa. Why? Because they always thought it would be interesting to steal something. In fact, they did steal a few things from the Louvre. It was never fully, they always kind of said they had, but I think Picasso had a few indigenous African statues that he did steal from that time. So, they were suspects, but it wasn't them. What it was a man named Vincenzo Peruggia. He was an employee at the Louvre, but he's a fierce Italian nationalist, and he hated the idea that the French owned something that should have been a national treasure of Italy. So he stole it, and he kept it in his apartment for like 2 years. And eventually he put it in a suitcase and he took it on a train and he went down to Florence, and he went to the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, which is the premier art gallery in Florence today. And he tried to sell it to them. And of course they knew it was stolen. And I think they bought it, they got him arrested. They showed it for 2 weeks to show that we've got it back, and then they gave it back to the Louvre. But after that, it was in all the newspapers, and everybody, was up in why was it stolen, and should it go back to the Louvre? And then after that, it's had a very interesting history ever since. It's been vandalized quite a bit. Acid was thrown on it in 1956 by some visitor. Red paint was thrown on it. It was, rocks were thrown at it. And most recently, I think about 20 years ago, a woman who bought a ceramic teacup in the Louvre museum shop took that teacup and smashed it against the image itself. So it's become this image for protest. And now it has, bulletproof glass around it, of course. And it exists within a very strange context of what art means and what power and dominance means in the world. And we haven't even got into what the actual work of art means, and why it's so special, and why I'm just talking about the material data of what happened to this work as an object. And that's what you're doing when you describe the materiality of a work of art. I don't want to go on too long here, but I think it's really important to understand that our experience of the Mona Lisa is quite different today than another work of art that happens to be in the same room of the Louvre. So if you're in the Louvre and you're in this very large room where the Mona Lisa is, you will see an enormous crowd in front of it. In fact, sometimes it's impenetrable and you won't even get near the Mona Lisa unless you arrive at a particular time at the Louvre. So you'll see a crowd there. Today, when there's a crowd there, it's all arms up in the air, waving their cell phones, trying to get a picture of it, or themselves with a selfie with the Mona Lisa. And with these cell phones up and their arms up, you can't actually see the picture itself. Everybody's seeing it through the representation that happens in their cell phone. So the actual experience of the image is not only through this enormous crowd with all these cell phones and selfies being taken and people standing in front of it, smiling to get their selfie done. But then it's behind bulletproof glass, and it's in this museum you had to pay to get into and travel all the way to France to. It's very exclusive, and the experience for most people could be either exhilarating or very disappointing. And just getting close enough to actually look at it is very difficult. However, if you turn around in the same room, you will see another work. And that work is by Veronese, Paolo Veronese, and it's called The Wedding Feast at Cana. And it was made around the same time. A little later, 1563. Nobody's ever in front of that image, although art historians know that this image is really important. And, and in this case, I've told you the title, which gives you a sense of what's going on. Wedding Feast at Cana, and if you're Christian or you know about Christianity, you know it's an important story within the New Testament. That's where Jesus turns water into wine at a banquet, a big wild feast. So we know that this is in a particular setting, and in fact, it was painted to be hung within a monastery in their refectory. Refectory is where they eat, and so it's a scene of eating in front of the place where a lot of monks would be eating. So the title opens up that. The date, we're now moving into the late Renaissance, so that triggers us to know that Veronese probably knew about what Leonardo da Vinci was doing. May not have seen the Mona Lisa, but certainly knew about him. He was, Leonardo was well known in his own time and knew what was going on, and he was pushing the boundary of what was considered to be high art. With Leonardo, it's the subtlety of expression and trying to get the clarity of a three-dimensionality that opens up into something that almost looks real. When we move into the later part of the 16th century, yes, it looks real, but now we're moving into what's called mannerism. And the artists are playing with space. So now this space is a little more compact, a little more compressed. It isn't as deep as the space that you get behind Mona Lisa with the landscape and everything. Here it's all kind of more like a stage set. Also, the color is a little brighter and the lighting is a bit strange, and all the bodies are slightly distorted with what we call foreshortening. So there's a kind of critique going on of what Leonardo was doing. So it's a good choice to put the two in the same room. Okay? Third thing, we did the title, we did, of course, we know who did it, and we can learn about Veronese and his intent, and I just indicated a bit of it. The third thing is its size, and that is probably the number one criteria here of why it's in the same room and why it's so interesting. The size here, now remember, Mona Lisa was 21 inches by 30 inches. This is 22 feet by 32 feet. It's one of the largest works of art in the Louvre. And it was one of the largest works of art in its own time. It was a huge, huge undertaking. This took a long time for Veronese to make. He was a fast painter, but it takes time to put this together. Many assistants. He needed a room, a special gallery or room or space or a studio to just make this work of art. It's huge. And again, you can step out in your room where you are right now, 22 feet, and then imagine how long 32 feet is. So this is a type of work that makes you feel small. And it invites you into that world of the gallery itself, not the gallery, but the feast itself. You're being invited into that feast to interact along with all those who are enjoying the feast, including Jesus. So you're just one among others. It's a very different feeling being in front of this. When you look at it, you think, well, the other thing is that there's a lot of people in this, and there's 130 people in this, just below the middle line. Not only is there 130 people in this, there are 130 very contemporary people in this. First off, Veronese put his buddies in it. The other artists such as Titian and Tintoretto, they're all in here playing instruments at the front. There are famous people from his own time, but he dressed them up what's called a la Turca, in Turkish dress, to make them look oriental. But there are, the famous people of the day, princes and queens and politicians and cardinals and other famous people. He painted them all in, so all of his buddies are in this. And you might say that this work is somewhat reminiscent of the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album of 1967, or you can say that the Sgt. Pepper album was, riff on the Veronese painting, right? It's one or the other. So just getting a sense of the size, what's going on, that just gives you the material data. And as for what happened to this work, it's also very interesting. It was looted in the 18th century by Napoleon when they attacked Italy. Napoleon claimed it for himself, and so that's why it's in France, and now it's in the Louvre. Italy, of course, wants it back, but they say, oh, it's too big to move, which is stupid to say, but they've got it, and it brings in people. They value it so much that, along with the Mona Lisa, they were both hidden during World War II so that the Nazis wouldn't take it from them. But in this case, it was so large, they had to take it out of its frame and roll it up. Of course, that damages the canvas, but they did it anyways. They rolled it up, and it was moved from house to house to strange warehouses all over France so that nobody would know where it was until the war was over, and then they brought it back. And then they had to restore it, and it was just recently restored about 20 years ago into the way that we have it now. So that's the general history of this work of art as an object. Okay. We will go into other aspects that you need to look at when we look at art in the rest of the course, but this is a good base to get going. If there are any questions about anything in this little tutorial, contact me as usual, and I'll be happy to help you, and I look forward to you using some of these techniques when you look at the materiality. Carry on.